A second Harry Styles fanfiction movie has hit theaters, or at least the streaming platforms. Fics are being stripped for parts and sold, and every other book at Barnes & Nobles is being marketed as enemies to lovers if the characters have ever even hinted at disliking each other. We're discussing fanfiction's slow march towards its inevitable conquest of media and also the world, today on Fandom Investigators. By now, you've probably seen images like this relatively frequently. There'll usually be some sort of contemporary or fantasy romance, but there's plenty of other kinds of books too, and it will be surrounded by a bunch of phrases and words that are meant to describe the book in some way, usually with some cute little arrow graphics. We'll get into the practice as a whole in more detail later on, but for now I want to draw your attention to the specific words and phrases used. Words like slow burn, or fake dating, or enemies to lovers. You might be familiar with these words if you've ever read fanfiction before, but they have slowly permeated their way into mainstream media. These terms describe common tropes or motifs in media, but they come from fandom and fan communities. Fanfiction, in my mainstream media, it's more likely than you may think. Something else. If you're on commentary YouTube at all, you may be familiar with a movie called After, which I have admittedly never watched, but I may be willing to someday. As you may know, I am willing to suffer for my art. This movie came out in 2019, and although it was widely critically panned and bullied mercilessly by YouTubers, it did quite well, as did its many sequels. Of course, one note about this movie is that it is based on a fanfiction involving popular singer Harry Styles, who is styled, so to speak, in the movie as Hardin Scott. After has a whole cinematic universe of sequels of its own, but it has also been joined by the Anne Hathaway-led The Idea of You, which is a film that is about a romance between a mom and definitely not Harry Styles. And it is also, yes, based on a fanfiction. I don't even know. The presidential debate happened last night. If I had a nickel for every time they made a movie based on a fanfiction about Harry Styles,
I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
Also, by the way, I'm not trying to copy Sarah Zed's vibe. I just have a cold. So if my voice sounds weird, also, that's why. But now that we know where we are, a world where A-list celebrities get multi-million-dollar paychecks by being in Harry Styles fanfiction cinema, a world where cringe is made up and copyright doesn't matter, and a world where the membrane between fanfiction and original fiction is getting increasingly thinner, I think it's time we zoomed out and figured out how exactly we got here. But before we do that, if you really want to know more about where we are and where we really are and how we got here and even maybe where we're going, then I suggest you like this video, maybe leave a comment, and subscribe to support both me and the channel. Thank you very much. So if you're into fanfiction in some way or fandom, you've probably been subjected to some level of fanfiction apologetics, which holds that fanfiction has a long and illustrious tradition dating all the way back to Dante writing Bible fanfiction in Inferno, or in fact even earlier, where they hold that some books of the Bible are fanfiction in and of themselves. They note folkloric tales where every storyteller makes the story their own in some way. They cite titles like Wide Sargasso Sea as fanfiction, or note licensed novelized tie-ins to franchises like Star Wars as fanfiction themselves. And I don't necessarily disagree. Intellectual property laws haven't existed forever, certainly, and there is truly nothing new under the sun. Originality is a tricky concept for anyone to deal with, and often your work will suffer if you get too caught up in the supposed novelty of it. But I do often find this line of argument to be a little bit of a deflection from the real point. When the vast majority of people, including people in fandom, talk about fanfiction, they are not talking about Dante's Inferno. They are talking about My Immortal, which is only marginally less influential. And this modern version of fanfiction, what we actually call fanfiction, dates back pretty directly, like most things in fandom, to Star Trek. I'm not going to give a full history of fanfiction here because it doesn't feel necessary, but I do think it bears mentioning that what we consider to be the modern tradition of fanfiction is pretty well agreed to have come from early Star Trek fanzines. And yes, that means that there was Slash in the very beginning of fanfiction. Who's shocked? Slash being fanfiction that explores the romantic connection between two men, in this case, those two men very much being Kirk and Spock from Star Trek, being those two as they are what I would consider kind of the granddaddies of all fandom at this point. Fanfiction has had a winding path since then, I would say, but it really did start to take off with the advent of the internet, which made finding like-minded individuals a lot easier for all of us little weirdos. Fanfiction lived in a variety of fan sites and specific forums until the creation and popularization of things like social media sites and fanfiction specific websites. For example, thinking here like LiveJournal and fanfiction.net. Eventually, the more popular current locales for fanfiction were created, like Tumblr or Wattpad, or the biggest one, which is AO3, Archive of Our Own. And for much of this history, it's worth noting that writing fanfiction was something that was done carefully and with a pretty heavy dose of secrecy. It wasn't acceptable societally or even by the authors of the original work that some of this fanfiction was being created from. It used to be much more common for authors to express disdain or dislike for fanfiction unto the point of pursuing legal action against fanfiction authors. And in terms of society as a whole, even as recently as 10 years ago, Benedict Cumberbatch, actor behind one of the most fanfictionized characters of all time, was saying pretty dismissive stuff about fanfiction in an interview. Because, you know, they either want to make John into a sort of a cute little toy, or me into a cute little toy, or we're in space on a bed chained together. Cumberbatch is referring to the rapacious slash fiction community that has turned his chilly, acerbic, and distinctly asexual Sherlock into a lustful monster. It's always like, one of them is tired, one comes back from work, the other is a lump appears in his trousers and then they're at it, he says. It's usually me getting it. I'm biting Watson's dog tags. And I don't really blame the guy. I think if you're not familiar with the whole idea, it's pretty easy to have a very limited and biased view of what fanfiction is and what it's for. Although yes, I am certainly not the first person to see the grand irony of playing the titular character in an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes and also looking down upon fanfiction. So how did we get from there to here? Would you guys hate me if I said it was 50 Shades of Grey? Yes? Okay, well good, because I'm not going to say that. I'm gonna give a way more boring answer. Well, except for in like one respect. Okay, here. Overall, I think it was mostly just a gradual change. Wah, wah, wah. I know, we hate that. Fanfiction becoming more acceptable just slowly over time, the proliferation of geek culture in the 2010s, and the popularity of online fandom activity just slowly growing over time meant that a lot more people just became like exposed to fanfiction in a more normal way. It was kind of chill. Especially in terms of the publishing industry, young people who are into books are way more likely to be into reading and writing fanfiction in my personal experience. And then some of those people are the people that grow up and enter the publishing industry. And then suddenly you look up and one day, whoops, the entire publishing industry is really into fanfiction just like personally. In fact, 50 Shades of Grey probably in some ways hurt the like movement for fanfiction acceptance, given especially how it was like extremely poorly written and famous for being wildly sexual. Something that a large portion of the public, especially the American public, just tends not to be a huge fan of for some reason. But although 50 Shades of Grey might have been popularly hated and lampooned as extremely embarrassing, things don't always have to be good to reach a certain amount of social acceptability. If things make enough money, a lot of the time they will at least be widely tolerated, if not completely embraced or considered high art. Take, for example, the Paul brothers. And 50 Shades of Grey made an ungodly amount of money. So even if it didn't make fanfiction socially acceptable, it did show companies that there was money to be made here, which quite frankly is probably more important. 50 Shades directly created the recipe for success for something like the After franchise, which plucks a basic romantic fiction with a large following from the clutches of the internet and turns it into an extremely marketable movie about very boring people. And After didn't even have The Weeknd on the soundtrack. But that's about where I would say we were. Getting there, slowly, and with plenty of money to be gained. Right up until the year that changed everything forever. I wonder what year that could have been. All joking aside, like a lot of things on the internet, fan fiction went like turbo mode in 2020. A lot of people had nothing to do. They maybe lost their jobs and they definitely couldn't go outside. So what was there to do but binge watch TV shows or Twitch streams, make new coffee recipes, and read or write fan fiction? This graph from AO3 shows pretty well the rise in weekly comments and site traffic from before 2020 and through the first 4 months of 2020, and it didn't end there. These graphs show AO3's daily traffic in 2020 and 2021. You'll notice that the highest daily traffic in 2020 was recorded as 61.1 million and the lowest at 31.3 million, while in 2021, the highest daily traffic was 74.8 million and the lowest at 56.7 million. I'm not sure of current day traffic numbers. Third parties don't have access to that information from the archive, and as far as I know, they haven't published anything themselves recently. But it's pretty clear that the site's popularity exploded during the pandemic. This popularity has had some pretty noticeable effects surrounding the culture of fanfiction on the internet. I personally have noticed a lot more discussion and community arguments over various issues around fandom and fanfiction etiquette since this explosion in popularity, and I've also noticed some pretty big clashes between people who would consider themselves to be in fandom and those who would not. I think that increased popularity has also led to some increased exposure of fandom and fanfiction to people outside the community, which has led to some pretty big arguments surrounding issues like cringe culture. If you're interested in some of the other negative effects of this growth in popularity, I would suggest watching my recent video on legality in fanfiction. I talk quite a bit there about trends surrounding the monetization of fanfiction. I would really recommend checking that out. But now we live in a world where fanfiction is pretty popular, and movies and novels based on fanfiction have previously established profitability. Add to that an extremely precarious publishing industry, which is putting pressure on authors to reach pre-made and secure audiences. And you end up in our current situation. Although the percentage of fanfiction that actually gets published as an original work is an extremely small proportion of the total amount of fanfiction out there, it has undeniably grown larger, and perhaps even more influential is the trend of marketing original work as though it were fanfiction. An example of that being those images that I showed earlier, wherein authors were marketing their work using fanfiction terminology. Disclaimer here, I am aware that several of those tropes and terms being used describe things that happen in fiction, in conventional fiction and conventional stories all the time. What I am saying is that the specific terminology being used was developed by fan communities and originally utilized in fanfiction. okay? I know that the concept of enemies to lovers has existed for a long time. I'm talking about the words. This appeal to tropes is really interesting to me, given that I think at least part of this adoption of fanfiction terminology is somewhat incidental, as then I think that it just kind of works out a lot of the time, that the way that fan fiction works is it uses short phrases and terms to describe these bits and pieces and tropes that are used within the fanfiction work in a way that's really familiar to the audience, partially because of the way that fanfiction platforms work themselves. And then I think that that method of description plays really well with current trends in marketing and cultural discussion surrounding media, which relies pretty heavily on discussion of the tropes and motifs that are used. I don't blame authors for doing what works, and I honestly don't even blame consumers in this case either. A lot of marketing for books especially, but for everything, is done either via image or via very, very short video. And readers are making snap decisions based on pretty limited information. But I also, at the same time, understand why this practice of marketing based on tropes has gotten a lot of pushback recently. I like when tropes are used in fanfiction, and I like when they're used in novels. I think that they are important tools that authors can use and manipulate within their works. I also don't think that they're the end-all be-all of storycraft or literary fiction. Marketing based solely on tropes doesn't really always give you a very good idea of the story or characters as a whole, and if it does, well, I think that's a little bit of a concern about the depth and complexity of your story. And again, I don't blame authors for this, but I do think it's a little bit worrying just how much marketing is revolving exclusively around sound bites right now. And not just marketing, also popular commentary. Like, I get why you would describe things this way, but I also personally am not gonna read a book just because you say it's dark academia, and I liked one other novel that you said was dark academia one time. Like, Romeo and Juliet is enemies to lovers, actually, you know? But I kind of feel like it's got a little more going on than just that. Who's to say? This development in marketing leaves us in the current moment. A moment where I would consider fanfiction to be relatively mainstream, even if it's still kind of cringe. I mean, there are lots of people who would consider romance novels cringe themselves, or even all genre fiction. And those are both pretty damn mainstream. I do think it's worth considering, though, what kind of fanfiction has achieved that mainstream status. These works that are based on fanfiction, are they a good representation of what fanfiction is? Or is it industries and capitalism mining our communities for what's marketable and leaving everything else in the dust? I am not someone who considers fanfiction to be sacred, and I will also acknowledge that there are huge and very real problems within fanfiction and fandom communities. For example, fandom historically has a lot of issues with both women and people of color. However, you also cannot deny the absolutely huge import of fanfiction focusing on same-sex relationships, particularly between two men. If you use AO3 in particular, you might actually think that there is only fanfiction written about two men, but other sites do have larger proportions of primarily heterosexual romance fiction. Either way, this is a huge part of fanfiction and has been historically. Remember the Star Trek zines and the Kirk-Spock / shipping? And so it's pretty telling to me that the movies and books that have been funneled from fanfiction and into more traditional media are what? Relatively conventional romances wearing Harry Styles hats on their hairy heads? The concept of heterosexual couple where one of them has shoulder-length black hair and the other one's a brunette with a goddamn bun? And I will say honestly, personally, I'm fine if this is the most mainstream fanfiction ever goes. I'm already a little uncomfortable with the scrutiny, and it's pretty obvious that outside of the world of fanfiction, queer media has made some incredible strides, and it's certainly not suffering just because no one has published their 200,000 word Steric epic yet. But I do think it's important to acknowledge the nuance of the situation in as clear-eyed of a way as we possibly can. Fanfiction is more more acceptable and more popular now. But it's only some fanfiction in some ways to some people. And ultimately, it's only because it's making money. So I can't necessarily say if fanfiction going mainstream is ultimately good or bad. All I can say is that it's pretty complicated and pretty capitalist. I'm so tired now.